look at some inequalities that exist at all levels of society that can specifically concern mental health, some objective reports. At the micro level, which is person-to-person relations, we are miseducated about mental disorder into saying things such as, stop acting like that, or you just aren't smart enough to understand or learn. We tend to avoid conversation if it's hard to relate to the person, or just ignore them altogether when we pass them on the street, as if they are not human with the same basic needs as ourselves, such as the need for recognition. Caretakers are people who live with a person who has mental illness, and they spend on average 32 hours per week of unpaid care for their loved one. And that doesn't include their regular job and what else have they do in life. Daily interaction with our loved one is already hard. It's only that much harder when someone is experiencing a mental disorder. Some quick facts: 8.4 million Americans provide care to an adult with a mental illness. And these numbers don't include all disorders such as autism that oftentimes require higher levels of care. Furthermore, in some situations, due to health needs going unheard and therefore aren't met, people with a mental disorder have a 40 to 60% greater chance of dying prematurely than the general population due to cancers, cardiovascular diseases, diabetes, and HIV infection and suicide. These issues aren't caused by mental health disorders, but are permitted to persist due to them not receiving the care they need. And some of these diseases can come as a result of taking prescribed medications as well. We'll get into that a little bit later. Then at the meso level of society, that is the community settings and cultural norms we see avoidant behaviors. People may say, why isn't he or she talking? Oh wow, they're weird. Or is this person talking to themselves? Or we assume their clothes are dirty, so they are just a dirty person. There is this notion in community settings that weaknesses are okay, but not a weakness where you're hearing things that aren't there, or you fidget. Those weaknesses make you mean you should be hidden somewhere and not seen in this public space. Not realizing that this person is probably doing their best or probably experiencing some sort of onset and need further direction in their life, which we all need at some point. Historically, at the meso level, the 19th century, people with mental disorders were sent away to asylums. This was just the known thing to do. It wasn't seen as crazy or inhumane. Was the norm. Journalist Nellie Bly in 1887 captured the asylum atmosphere when she went undercover at the Blackwell Island Insane Asylum in New York. She was committed without an examination to determine her sanity. The conditions were harsh, cruel, and inhumane. Here is a report of what she found. For crying, the nurses beat me with the broom handle and jumped on me, described one patient to Bly. Then they tied my hands and feet and throwing a sheet over my head, twisted it tightly around my throat so I could not scream, and thus put me in a bathtub filled with cold water. They held me under until I gave up every hope and became senseless. Now, what this patient is describing is hydrotherapy. It proved to be a very popular technique. It is where cold water allegedly reduced the agitation, particularly for those experiencing manic episodes. People were either submerged in a bathtub for hours at a time, mummified in a wrapped pack, or sprayed with a deluge of shockingly cold water in showers. And this was done to people with all types of disorders, because in the 19th century, disorders were, as they are today, still being researched heavily, and so there was less classifications of what disorder was what. So even people with developmental disabilities who may have just been having a tantrum or upset about something were treated like this as well. So deinstitutionalization, which was the releasing of people with mental disorders from asylums and psychiatric centers, It began in the 1950s and it impacted all components of the criminal justice system, including law enforcement, prisons and jails, courts, and our communities. As a result, 20% of people who are homeless also have a serious mental illness. There weren't enough community resources for these people once they were released from asylums. Today, even in some countries, we still see people with mental disorders chained, either for their own protection or for the apparent protection of others. They are kicked out of community settings such as churches and other religious establishments. And it's a fact that 60% of U.S. counties do not have a single practicing psychiatrist. And then at the micro level of society, that is institutional settings such as prisons and healthcare systems, we see an overrepresentation of people with mental illnesses without a home and inside of a prison. This is referred to as the criminalization of mental illness. There is a lack of quality and affordable medical coverage for mental health disorders, which are in fact a medical concern. Medication for mental disorder is expensive. Hospitalization and residential treatment is expensive. Most disorders require intensive care, which is also expensive. For example, the recommended number of hours for autism spectrum disorder, ABA therapy, is anywhere between 10 to 30 hours per week. And it is only within the last 5 years that it became mandated that ABA services are covered through insurances. But that's only for people with autism, when the therapy works for a variety of disorders. There are different types of mental disorders. There's mental illnesses, and usually mental illnesses where we see symptoms such as hallucinations, delusions, or uncontrollable emotions. These mental disorders are usually stereotyped more heavily, and we see that they're dangerous, they're possessed, they're not fully human, versus the developmental and intellectual disabilities. People are more caring from the heart to work with these individuals. Some historical inequalities at the macro level include the Eugenics Movement in the U.S., which was a 1940s theory that people with desirable traits should outbreed the less desirable. There we see psychiatric surgeries for the treatment of mental illnesses like sex sterilization and frontolobotomies, which is a surgical procedure that removed chunks of a person's brain. In 1927, the Buck versus Bell trial was necessary because the compulsory sterilization of the mentally ill, unfit or / mentally ill did not violate the due process clause in the 14th Amendment. This meant that it was legal. It was legal to use these treatments on people who had a mental disorder. They were seen as inferior. They were seen as needing to be bred out along with other subgroups of humans. Today, at the macro level, some inequalities that we see are 56 of state prisoners, 45 of federal prisoners, and 64 of jail inmates have a mental illness. 10 to 20% have a serious mental illness. 1 out of 37 adults, and 1 out of 37 adults in some form of correctional facility. So there's a lot of adults actually in our institutional prison systems. In 44 states, a jail or prison holds more mentally ill individuals than the largest remaining psychiatric hospital. Some other impacts of how mental health even affects us at the macro level. Depression and anxiety disorders cost the global economy $1 trillion each year in loss of productivity. And by combining medical and behavioral healthcare services, the United States could save $37.6 billion to $67 billion a year. Yet we still haven't reached that level where we're getting full-time mental health coverage. So addressing institutional issues such as the overrepresentation of mental illness in the prison system or the lack of medical care for mental health concerns, all these start honestly in our individual relationships. Do we care for the people who are around us? Do we care to do our research? Do we care to go and advocate? Interactions are verbal and nonverbal. We are constantly interacting with people around us, whether we speak or remain silent, look at them in the eye or look around them. We are constantly interacting. And I have an example for this. I was sitting at a Starbucks one day when an individual was sitting next to me. He was fidgeting and he was drinking his tea or coffee that he had paid for, and he was sitting there enjoying it. And his clothes looked like he may have been homeless, or maybe he had a rough day, but he didn't have anything with him. He honestly looked like like he was homeless to me. Fidgeting, and then I noticed a man sitting on the other side of him noticed the same thing, and he looks over and he got really uncomfortable, and he was like, oh my goodness, like he was offended, and he started to pack up his stuff and he left. And it just made me uncomfortable to see that, because I know the gentleman noticed what was going on. As I peeked over at him, he was looking around like, oh no, do they notice I'm fidgeting like really hard? No telling what was going on. Maybe he was having a reaction to some type of drug, or it could be Tourette's, who knows? So you know when people are uncomfortable around you, and the gentleman was that offended when the man was sitting there just trying to enjoy his drink. And so that's just an example of how we have set these cultural norms to say, oh, that doesn't need to be handled here, you need to go somewhere else. And he wasn't causing any disturbance to you, but maybe he was, and just in my opinion he wasn't. So right here is a mental health chart. It just shows how small systems affect our large systems. And this is from NAMI, the National Alliance of Mental Illness. So in order to reconcile individual relationships and issues that have occurred due to mental disorder in our communities, it's important that we're able to see each other, each human, as equal in value added to that we add to the world, equal in our potential that we have to live a fulfilling life, and also equal in the fact that we each have weaknesses. I would like to thank you so much for joining me for video 2 on reconciliation, the restoration of friendly relations. We're in the effort to foster better relationships with people with mental disorders in our communities. We discussed our faulty human condition that requires us to continually be intentional in our relationship at every level of society. Thank you so much.